Thanks a lot for having us here. Maybe just a few words of introduction. So Sean and I know each other from the Bitcoin world. I didn't actually realize you were going to be here on this conference, so it's fantastic. It's a great coincidence. So we thought we should do this together because we've both been very involved in this space from slightly different angles, but effectively doing more or less the same thing. So I'll give a few words of introduction about myself, what I'm doing in the Bitcoin space. Maybe you can do the same with your Bitcoin hat on.
Yep.
And then maybe we can go through some of the thoughts we want to share with you guys. But before I do that, very quick question. Who has a Bitcoin wallet with more than 0 Bitcoin here in this room? One?
At least one person? Yeah.
One?
Okay, 2 or 3. Yeah.
2, 3. Okay,
Yeah.
all right. So that's good. That's encouraging. At least we're not the only ones.
We're not the only weirdos. Yeah.
So a couple words of introduction. So Hummingbird Ventures, an early seed and early stage fund. We've done quite a few investments in Turkey. But beyond that, all of us have caught the Bitcoin bug in the last 18 months. We really think that blockchain technology, digital currency, and Bitcoin will change the world. And we're hoping to share some of that with you in this presentation. So concretely speaking, what we've done is a couple of things. So we've invested in one company in this space called Kraken, which is a Bitcoin exchange. It's a place where you can buy and sell Bitcoin. They're based in San Francisco, but they mostly focus on the euro and Bitcoin pair. So they have the most market share in that pair at the moment as an exchange. We've also been busy organizing an event in both San Francisco and London called Coin Summit. So our last event in San Francisco was headlined by Mark Andreesen, founder of Andreessen Horowitz. And it was just a great way to get the community together to talk about this new exciting space. And obviously we all also believe in the currency, so we've been dabbling in buying, not so much selling, this new asset class. So it's something we're very excited about.
Yeah, and for me, I think I mentioned I was a founder previously to this. My startup didn't work out. As part of that, I had to lay off my entire staff. And so I had about 30 computers that were just sitting there. And I literally read a forum about Bitcoin. And we'll talk a little bit about mining, which is part of how Bitcoin is supported. So I got into it because I had all these computers. I wanted to get all these computers mining Bitcoin. I thought, well, maybe I'll mine some Bitcoin and actually save my company, or maybe it'll just be a fun technical exercise. And so that's what got me into it. And I think you'll sort of agree that like Bitcoin, for a lot of folks, it quickly goes from hobby to obsession. If you were around in the mid-90s, the feeling is very similar. So a lot of us feel that this is just like the internet. The way that it changed the world, Bitcoin is going to do this for the financial market, which obviously is massive. And so as part of that, when I joined 500, my focus for 500 is also on Bitcoin investments. I've made about 14 investments in total, primarily focused on infrastructure, developer tools, things to kind of get this ecosystem started. So it's still very early. It's still very difficult to use, which is why only 3 of you or so are using in the audience. And so I'm investing in sort of the initial infrastructure layer, and we'll move into sort of consumer adoption when we're ready for that. But that is already growing today.
So the title of the presentation is terrible. It's like the most uncool, boring title. I apologize for that title. Actually, this is a presentation I used a couple months ago for an LP presentation for the Hummingbird investors, so the people who invest in our fund. But actually, the title should really be why Bitcoin is going to be a major revolution, possibly bring down governments, change the way we live, change the way we transact. It's something that's that big. We're not talking about something that's just interesting for VCs because it's like some sort of new vertical technology. It has much, much more deep ramifications, and hopefully we'll try and get some of that across as well in this presentation. So let's see if I can. Okay, so focusing first really on the reason why this is important from a business perspective. Bitcoin is probably going to disrupt a very, very large number of industries. So you look at payment processing. It's an industry with almost $500 billion of market cap. You look at the money transfer business or remittance business where people send money from one country to another. It's also a big industry. You look at the payment hardware industry. You look at the bank software industry. And those are just some of the industries that are going to be disrupted by this. Actually, one of the things that I hope we can get across in this presentation as well is that overall, probably the whole financial services industry, the investment banking industry, the commercial banking industry are going to be very, very affected and disrupted by this. So it's really worth thinking about this because it's going to change a lot of industries in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, also what's interesting too, many of these businesses, Western Union especially, like they haven't changed in something like 50 years. So SWIFT payments, which a lot of the money is moved around, that was invented in the 70s. So they're actually ripe for disruption. They're using very, very old systems. In other countries, actually, some of this stuff works fairly well. In the US, though, like, you got to wire money, you got to fill out a form, takes a few days, there's a big fee. Western Union is charging 10%. Think about that when you're sending money back to India or to some other family that needs help. 10% of that money is going into Western Union. So they have very, very fat margins for what they're doing. Bitcoin sort of serves to disrupt that, provide actually a better level of service and cheaper for the consumer as well.
Having said that, it's very early days, and I think this process is a process that's going to take 10 to 15 years. You guys might be aware that every technology goes through the initial peak of excitement, then the trough of disillusionment. And I think Sean reminded me there is something called a plateau of productivity.
Yep, getting close to that, yeah.
And eventually you get to nirvana, where everybody uses technology and you've created a lot of value. I think with Bitcoin, we're either in a trough of disillusionment or in the very early phases of the plateau of productivity at the moment. There was a lot of excitement around Bitcoin about a year and a half ago. The price of Bitcoin went up to $1,100. Now it's back down to about $250. And I think everybody realizes now that there's going to be a lot of hard work over the next couple of years to turn this into a technology that can be used by everyone. So if you compare this to, or if maybe you want to do it, compare this to...
Let me throw a question to you. Do you think Bitcoin is a currency or is it a technology?
So, very good question. So Bitcoin is definitely more a technology than a currency. But what's interesting about Bitcoin, I think, is that Bitcoin is like a crystal, right? And depending on where you come from as an individual, you might look at it through one particular prism of that crystal. So some people look at Bitcoin as a currency. It's probably a very narrow way to look at Bitcoin. Some people with, say, a computer science or maths background will look at this as a beautiful new technology that can be used to change a lot of things that we do at the moment, probably in some very imperfect ways. But then you can look at it from even more and more angles. I think it's probably worthwhile, we'll get there in this presentation, but probably taking a step back and explaining what Bitcoin is and why it's so revolutionary. So one of the things about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is a ledger, or blockchain technology is a ledger that keeps track of who owns what. So for example, it keeps track of the fact that I may be owning 5 Bitcoin, you may be owning 20 Bitcoin, etc. But what's interesting about this ledger is that the ledger is not controlled by anybody in particular. So whereas in the past you had a central bank or you had a bank that kept track of who owned what, with Bitcoin or blockchain technology, the core disruptive or revolutionary part about this is that the ledger is distributed. So just like with Skype, you can make a call that gets routed through different people's computers. With Bitcoin, you've got a peer-to-peer network that collectively keeps track of who owns what. And the core technology that makes that possible is cryptography. So that is the very fundamental thing behind Bitcoin. So until now, we've always assumed that there needed to be some sort of government or central party that had the authority to issue money. With Bitcoin, we've come up with a technology and an invention that says, actually, you know what? We don't need the government or a central party to issue money or keep track of who owns what. The collective, meaning the tens of thousands or millions of computers that are on the Bitcoin network, keeps track of who owns what. If some of these computers go down, it's not a problem. The rest of the network will continue running that ledger. So that's really the core technology behind Bitcoin. And that's why probably at the heart, what's fascinating about this is the blockchain technology and what you can build on top of that.
Yeah, the ledger is the most exciting part. I mean, it's a whole new paradigm on the database, and it's a level of transparency that we really haven't had before. It's a lot like an onion. You just keep peeling that thing back, and you're like, man, this can do a lot of different things. It's not just a currency. It's not just a payment rail. Think about stocks and equity. Think about other ways, you want to audit someone financially. So I think that's what a lot of people are getting excited about. And if Bitcoin failed as a currency, blockchain technology, I think, has a whole nother life, and we've barely begun to see what's there.
So if you compare Bitcoin to the internet, back in 1994, there are a lot of similarities, or blockchain technology. A lot of the action or the investments are in the core network and core infrastructure. Today, with blockchain and Bitcoin, it's mining companies, and it's kind of the Wild West in the mining technology space right now, with a lot of companies getting funded, some companies going bust as well, going out of business. Same thing with the internet in the 90s. Routers and core infrastructure were a very big part of the, and ISPs as well, were a very big part of the investment themes back in those days. With the internet, the browser was one of the first primary on-ramps onto the internet that made it possible for a lot of people to finally start enjoying the benefits of this new technology. know, with Bitcoin at the moment, wallets are one of the ways for people to use Bitcoin. So a lot of investment, and a lot of new startups, a lot of innovation is in the wallet space. Then you know, in this slide I drew a parallel between ISPs and exchanges. So exchanges are a place where you can use your dollar, euro, or pound currency to acquire this new digital currency. Likewise with the ISPs, which were the primary on-ramp onto this. Then you know, there are other parallels that I drew on this slide, but probably for the sake of speed, maybe we shouldn't spend too much time on them. But one of the important points here is that for this new space really to gain wide acceptance, blockchain technology has to be used by a lot of people for something. So with Bitcoin in particular, which is one application of blockchain technology or one currency, you can use Bitcoin to transact. So instead of paying Visa and MasterCard, say 3% or 2%, a 2% fee to enable this transaction for an e-commerce transaction, what you can do with Bitcoin is you can effectively run the same transaction at a very, very small fee, probably a few cents in the case of Bitcoin today. The problem, of course, is that not a lot of merchants accept Bitcoin yet, although it's changing. So some of the very large merchants that we're all using, like Expedia, have started using Bitcoin. And Microsoft have recently started using Bitcoin on their Xbox franchise. And I think, Sean, what would be your guess to the number of merchants accepting Bitcoin today around the world?
You know, good question. It's probably fairly low. It's probably in the 5,000 to 10,000 range, I would say.
Yeah.
With, you know, a few being large. So they're sort of adapting new technology to see what's there. But consumer adoption is a little bit slow. There's about 1 million people using Bitcoin, which when you think about the grand scheme of things, pretty small.
Very, very small still.
Yep.
Agreed. So there have been a lot of venture investments in the Bitcoin space in the last, or blockchain space in the last 2 to 3 years. I think last year we've seen a peak in investments.
It's about 140 million, I think, something like that.
Yeah, so on the next slide, I think we've got some details of those investments. So as of the time when this presentation was prepared, which is a couple of months ago, there was close to $200 million that went in. That number is now probably up to almost $300 million because one company, Coinbase, raised a very large round recently.
Yep.
And a number of other companies, probably another 20 or 30 companies raised money in the meantime. So this is definitely a theme that has taken, that is interesting venture capitalists. And I think we'll see sustained investments, although probably the fact that we're probably more in the trough at the moment has somehow lowered the pace of those investments.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the big firms, they've made their bet, whether that be Coinbase or someone else. So they're going to wait and see what happens. A lot of these VCs, LPs were pushing them, saying, I keep hearing about this Bitcoin thing. What is it? So go make an investment. So they've made their bet, and it may be 1 or 2 years before we see where they go. So I think you're right. It's going to slow down just a little bit, especially those large rounds, those $10 to $50 million rounds.
So what's also encouraging is that when you look at angel lists, the number of people interested in Bitcoin keeps increasing. So there are a lot of metrics that are showing a lot of smart people are putting their thinking cycles onto this. And then likewise with the number of startups listed on the angel list, and that curve is keeps growing. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, this is great too. Actually, what's more interesting, if you look at, GitHub is a big depository for programmers. You can actually look and see what the level of interest is in different verticals. And if you compare Bitcoin to Stripe or other major sort of technologies, Bitcoin's just blowing it away. So engineers, I know I was making fun of them a little bit in my earlier presentation, but like engineers are very interested in this. This is a whole new world for them. And so GitHub has a very similar chart where you can see the engineering interest is sort of through the roof.
So, because this is digital currency, some of the folks I explain this for the first time say, well, but who's actually making money out of this, or what's the, is this real, or is this just some sort of virtual game that you're playing? So mining, which is the process by which people acquire new Bitcoin or digital currency, is at this point a very real business, and some of the larger mining companies are mining a couple $100 million a year, depending on the price of the currency they're mining. But so in the 12 months period that is laid out on this chart, almost $600 million was collected by miners through the mining process. So the purpose of this presentation is not to go through the technical explanation of Bitcoin, which I would encourage you to do if this is of interest to you. But this is just to say that this is a real business. Mining is an industry that evolved extremely quickly over the last 3 years. At this point, the only way to do mining in Bitcoin efficiently is to use microchips that are dedicated for mining, and there are a number of companies that are specializing in that and are constantly coming up with new generations of chips. Actually, recently, Accel Partners invested in KNC Miner, which is, they invested in $15 million in KNC Miner, which is maybe actually even more than 15, but they're one of the large players in the design of those chips specifically for Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, and it's a bit like Murphy's Law. It's about the sort of the pace that these chips are being developed is increasing. And so actually this is what I would call the good old days. This is when I was actually mining. I was mining in my home. My wife hated it because she couldn't use a blow dryer sometimes. It would actually knock out the entire house. But nowadays, mining is a big game. You cannot be sort of a little guy or girl doing mining. It's big, big facilities, and a lot of it's moved to China as well.
So what's also fascinating about mining and the blockchain and Bitcoin is that people have really piled onto this. And when you look at the evolution of the amount of CPU power in the mining space, it's basically been an exponential curve, although lately it's kind of flattened out a bit.
Yeah, because it's less profitable now. There's other issues.
Exactly.
But even at this point, I think like this became the most powerful supercomputer in the world, and we've obviously gone much further.
Yeah, there is more CPU power mining Bitcoin today, collectively, by a factor of 100 or 1,000. So that CPU power is way bigger than the largest supercomputer in the world at this point. So the CPU power on this digital currency is phenomenal. Yeah, so I just wanted to show these numbers because, by the way, some of these companies have gone bust already, which shows how quickly things are evolving in the Bitcoin space. But I just wanted to give you an idea of the revenues of these individual miners to show you that this is already a real industry. Some of these players are doing $50 to $100 million of annual revenue. And these are companies that weren't even founded 2 years ago.
Yes, all estimated, because nobody wants to talk about what they're actually making.
That's right. So there are new players all the time. I just want to show some examples of some of the new. It's really like the Wild West. Bitcoin is like the Wild West. So this is an example of that. So this is some graphs based on Twitter and number of mentions of Bitcoin on Twitter, just showing that consumer interest, sorry, is perking up. And this is the rate at which people create new wallets on blockchain.info, which is one of the main wallet providers.
Yeah, and they're actually at 3 million now, so they've even grown a little bit faster.
Yeah.
So about double this right now.
So they've doubled in the last 8 months or so.
Yep.
Likewise, this is the number of new wallets on Coinbase, which is one of the competing services that offers wallets as well. So a lot of people ask me, well, how can I get involved in the currency side of this, which is probably what we should emphasize less, and I realize this presentation is probably has too much of an emphasis on the currency side, but the primary way to get involved is through exchanges. The biggest exchanges at this point are in China, I think it's fair to say, by far. The Chinese exchanges are dwarfing all the other exchanges. These market share charts are somewhat out of date, so and things tend to change every 3 months or so. But there are a number of players that dominate the exchange space. So BTC, BTC China is one of them. Bitfinex is another one. Bitfinex actually also in the Far East. And there are a number of other players. Coinbase has launched an exchange recently in the US, and they're now gathering a lot of liquidity because they're the first regulated exchange in the US.
Yeah, and there actually was an article today. CoinDesk is kind of the TechCrunch of Bitcoin. They actually talked about in Turkey now there's a new company that you can actually walk into a retail store and buy Bitcoin. So if you want to be part of this, I would say I wouldn't do it to make money, and I would only put the money that you're willing to lose into Bitcoin. But you also don't need to buy a full Bitcoin. I think that's the big misconception. You can buy fractional pieces as well, so you can actually kind of use it and transact and see what it's like. I mean, I would encourage people to try it. It's a little bit like aha moment. Probably, I don't know, maybe the first time you use Tender where it's like, oh wow, I get how this works. Very similar to Bitcoin. You know, once you actually transact and use it, then it actually makes a little bit more sense.
So we're talking about merchant adoption. So clearly at this point, Sean mentioned there are probably only about 5,000 merchants around the world that accept Bitcoin. So I used a service called coinmap.org to look at Amsterdam and look at the number of merchants that accept Bitcoin. You're welcome to go to CoinMap and see who accepts Bitcoin in Antalya or in Istanbul. So you'll probably find a handful of merchants accepting it on the map. But what we're seeing is that there is definitely a steady increase over time of the number of merchants accepting Bitcoin. And that's the, just used another website called Bitcoin Impulse to look at the number of merchants based on their data. So that's the end of the slides. So how much time do we still have? Because there are a few other things I'd love to discuss as well. 5 more minutes? Okay, great. So this presentation was focused on, the money side to, try and get people excited about the size of the industry and the fact that it's actually real. It's not just virtual. There is money to be made, etc. But I think what's a lot more fundamental here is the magic of this new technology. So if you think about, I'll start with Bitcoin, but then we'll talk about blockchain technology, Bitcoin 2.0, what can be done on top of this technology. But if you think about Bitcoin today, I could be waking up on a Sunday morning at 3 a.m. and let's say I would need to transfer a large amount of money to a friend of mine in Indonesia with whom I've got some sort of business going. And I could just instantly transfer, say, $1 million or whatever at a fractional transaction fee, let's say 2 cents, and instantly. And also irrevocably, because with Bitcoin, once you transfer money, it's like cash. There isn't sort of a process of trying to recover that money like you would with credit cards where you can contest a transaction, etc. So Bitcoin is like cash, but on the internet. And it's extremely powerful. So you can send an arbitrary amount of money instantly at an almost zero transaction fee at the moment. So that's quite magic. But if you think about what this technology allows, it actually allows for a lot more than that. The blockchain technology that underpins Bitcoin actually allows you to keep track of assets. So the first asset that you keep track of is actually this currency called Bitcoin, which runs on a network. But you could actually conceivably, and the technology allows for that, use this kind of technology to keep track of any type of asset. So you could say that you could put the title to your house on the blockchain network. You could put the title to your car on the blockchain network. If you're an investment bank, you could put the title to your bonds, to your equities, to whatever. And for example, in the investment banking industry, for those of you who know that industry, typical settlement processes take 3 to 4 days, and they have armies of people in their back offices just doing settlement all day long. And that in itself is billions and billions of dollars of cost. With blockchain technology, you can do that settlement instantly. Because as I said, this is a technology where a transaction is irrevocable, where ownership of an asset is very clear. Whoever owns the private key based on cryptography is the owner of that asset. So there is a lot of potential here to use this technology for much more than just this initial application, which is this quirky currency called Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I agree. And actually, it's funny. We're in Turkey. We're close to Cyprus. Like when the Cyprus bank issue happened, that actually drove a lot of Bitcoin adoption. So I think what we're talking about here is a network of trust, a network of trust that really cannot be broken. Math is very absolute. 1 is 1, and that's about it. There's no way to sort of break that up. And so it's really interesting. And I think I'd also just sort of finally add to, there's a lot of technology here, encryption, two-factor authentication. These are very difficult things for consumers to understand. So a lot of my view is that Bitcoin wins actually when consumers, people in the audience are using it, but they don't know. Just like a credit card. When you swipe that credit card, there's 100 things that are going on. There's all kinds of bells and whistles, different things that are going on. You don't need to know that, and you probably don't. So Bitcoin, I think, is what we're looking to invest in, which is why a lot of this is mining, infrastructure, development tools, really highly technical things. Consumers are probably not going to get to that level now or even the next few years. So we really need to be thinking, if you're thinking about building Bitcoin, if you're thinking about building Bitcoin apps, how can people leverage all the benefits without having to get too deep into the weeds of the actual technology itself?
And I also would like to leave you with one final thought, which is, with the internet, what happened is that in the old days, information tended to be controlled by choke points. If you wanted to get information, you got it from a newspaper or television, etc. And those were very centralized forms of information distribution. And oftentimes, unfortunately, as we also well know these days, they can be tightly controlled by the government or the power to be. So with the internet, suddenly, this peer-to-peer network made it possible for people to exchange information, stay abreast of what's going on with each other, without anybody being really able to control this source of information. I'd like to take this analogy to Bitcoin. With money has been controlled so far by powers to be, by the government, by central banks, by banks. With Bitcoin and this new technology, the blockchain technology, money becomes peer-to-peer. Nobody controls it anymore. So just think about the very profound implications that actually has on the world going forward.
Great. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a lot like Napster. I mean, Napster changed the world of music, and we're still recovering from it, and Apple built upon that too. So it's very, very similar technology. I think that's a good analogy to think about. The trust, the power can be put into your hands. You can be your own bank, you can transact, you can hold, you have a certain level of security that you're just not going to get with other folks.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.